Here we go.
Hello, and welcome to your wake up call. My name is Marc Caron, and today, as pretty much always, I'm coming to you from Vancouver, British Columbia. And wherever you are, whenever you're watching this, welcome and thank you for watching. And I want to always give a big shout out to PMC Global and the PSSM channel for their invitation to do your wake up call on their platform. And we still air it on our Conscious Living Radio, Conscious Living Network platform, and the people that I know in this part of the world. And today I have a great pleasure to introduce my guest, friend, co-worker, co-host, co-everything. He's been a buddy of mine now for a couple of years, and his name is Stephen Gray. Now, Stephen Gray, I met a few years back as he was the MC of the Spear Plant Medicine Conference here in Vancouver, British Columbia, and he's the author of a book called Cannabis and Spirituality. And one of the things I love about Stephen is he's done so much work in the field of, these ancient and indigenous medicines, and his work within cannabis and spirituality really woke me up to a new way of working with something that has typically had a negative connotation, being cannabis or marijuana or pot or dope or whatever people want to call it. And what I discovered over time was, especially through Stephen, the power that cannabis can have, not just medically speaking, but on a spiritual level. So, Stephen, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Marc.
It's always a pleasure to connect. And what I'd like you to do is maybe tell your story to our audience here in regards to how you kind of got into and discovering cannabis as a spiritual ally.
Boy, I could start just about anywhere on that one. Well, cannabis, apart from having been in certain smaller circles prior to, say, the mid-'60s or so, burst forth quite rapidly into the cultures, certainly in North America, and I imagine around about the same time, if not, not much later anyway, into Europe. Of course, it existed on the planet for long before humans, but that's another story. But as a known substance that was out of the sort of really, fringe corners of the of certain subcultures, it burst forth in the mid to late '60s, and that's when I came of age, actually, in the very late '60s, and just caught a little behind the Summer of Love '67 thing. But around about that time was when cannabis first made it to my suburban town in conservative Ontario near Toronto. And I could tell, quite a few stories about that, but I'll say a couple of them. One is that the very first time I took it, I thought, this is really interesting. And it wasn't what I would say spiritual at all. It was just another perspective. It mucked with time in a really interesting way. It opened up, a whole bunch of different things. And then it wasn't that long before I discovered that, well, I've always loved to dance, but when I was shy as a kid, and I was pretty physically reserved that way, around other people as far as expressing myself physically. But cannabis taught me to dance. Cannabis freed me up, and I discovered, well, I came of age at a very fortunate time in that sense. Prior to the late '60s, most dancing was done in couples, except perhaps show dancing, right? But for the regular folks, they tended to dance in couples, and you had certain dances you did, or you faked it or whatever. But the countercultural generation, of which I was a part, decided that you could just get up there and express yourself, just dance freely. And so I had one night, I won't take the time to go into the details, but I had one evening where I was at a club with some friends, and we had some pot, and there was a kind of an Irish jig being played, like a live band, and I got up and started jigging like crazy, or whatever you call those Irish, two-step dances. And My friends had never seen anything like it from me before. I came back to the table and their jaws were all about 3 feet lower than normal, right? It's like, where the hell did that come from? And it was the pot, right? And also, I could take up a lot of time by also telling you that it taught me to listen to music properly. When I say listen, I mean I won't go into details, but I was left alone in a room one time having smoked pot with some people, and they all left the room, and I was at a home with some people with a really good stereo system, and because I had nothing else to do, like normally you'd be kind of yakking over the music off and on, I just sat there and listened, and I went, holy mackerel, I can hear. This was like a band with 5 instruments or whatever, right? Bass, drums, keyboard, 2 guitars, vocals, and harmonies. And I suddenly realized I could hear every single one of those instruments separately and together. And it totally influenced me, so that was a start for cannabis. And then of course the psychedelics also came into the sort of semi-mainstream culture,
Well,
you could
late
say.
60s, that was the time for that.
Absolutely. So that they all dovetailed, and it just kind of went from there. I had periods. I was very involved with Tibetan Buddhism for about 10, 15 years, and nobody was smoking pot there. So I pretty much dropped it for about 10 years and then gradually came back to it. And then it started to dawn on me that this was a long stretch of time where this happened or unfolded, you might say. It began to dawn on me more and more that cannabis had this potential to go really deep. If you can, as Terence McKenna said about psychedelics, sit down, shut up, and pay attention. Of course, there are many other things you can do with cannabis, but it's my kind of niche, you might say, is that, as much as possible, get out of your own way, quiet the mind as much as possible, and pay attention. And of course, it doesn't have to be just, sitting down in a meditation. It can be doing yoga. It can be, as our guests Josh and Kelly were saying earlier today, sitting at a shrine in your garden and suddenly realizing there's 15 different kind of bees floating about. So it's this notion of becoming one with things, that when you get yourself out of the way, when you calm yourself down, and when you pay attention, cannabis has this potential to open things up and liven things, amplify your connection. The brain is on sort of not hyper alert, but hyper attention possibility. So that eventually led to me. I don't just refer to myself as the author of Cannabis and Spirituality, by the way. I authored about 20 to 25% of the content in the book, but there are 17 other contributors. So I'm as much editor as I am author of that book. I definitely don't want to downplay the fact that 17 other, really interesting people weighed in on that topic. But maybe you can cut me off and go elsewhere with this if you want, because I've been talking for a while, but until you do, I'll tell you one more little story.
Okay, give us one more story, Stephen.
There we go. Thank you for the permission. In 2012, I was involved in the conference, the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference by then, and I was doing more or less what I do now, which is dealing with presenters, finding them, working with them, sometimes hosting them to some degree when they get to Vancouver. And one of those was Kathleen Harrison, and she's an ethnobotanist, knows a lot about mushrooms and a whole bunch of other plants, and also a cannabis lover. And we were sitting, she asked me to take her around the day after the conference to see what was going on in the woods as far as mushroom growth, which was the season, for psilocybin around here, for one thing, and a few others. We didn't find any psilocybin mushrooms that day, but we did find a few. And then we were sitting in my car in the rain, waiting to go into Banyan Books. And I told her that I was thinking that cannabis needed a redress, but I didn't feel like I had a whole book in myself to do that. I didn't feel like that much of an authority. And she said, well, you know what, if you put that project together, I'll contribute to it, And she's a beautiful writer. She's working on a book now that I think is going to be amazing. I've seen several essays before from her, and that was it for me. It was like, okay, Kathleen Harrison's going to contribute to my book. She was the wife of Terence McKenna for 15 years, by the way. So right right smack in the middle of the psychedelic revolution, in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So that was it. That was 2012, and the book came out in 2016, and it's been doing really well. I've been, kind of surprised, quite honestly. It's probably sold close to 20,000 copies now.
Wow.
Which, well, I would say, less of a, gold star for me for that than the fact that it hit the zeitgeist at the right time. And that's what's really exciting, is that cannabis is now getting the kind of attention that it wasn't. I mean, and this is all, just blossomed in the last few years. Now there are people leading cannabis ceremonies all over the place, right? Working with cannabis in conjunction with yoga. If we have time, I'll tell you a little bit about my interview with Chris Killam recently, because his new book, The Lotus in the Bud, but we can go into that later. But anyway, yeah. So that's what's exciting about it, is that cannabis is starting to take its rightful place in the culture as a spiritual medicine, along with all the other excellent things that it can do when it's used, appropriately.
Yeah, well, it's, I'm going to start here. I love the fact of how you did compile the book, because, I love it when you can read a book that's, I'm not going to say necessarily an easy read, but it has a lot of good input from a lot of great experts, right? Instead of like a huge book on one person's thought behind or work towards it. So, I love the resourcefulness, you thinking you didn't have enough yourself to put together a whole book, and how one comment created, the possibility and opened that up for you, that 4 years later you had a book that's doing quite well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it is an easy read in that sense. I know what you mean by, you didn't want to sort of, disparage it by, like sort of grade 3 level reader or something,
exactly.
but it is easy to read. It's not an academic book. It's not dry. Probably the driest chapter in the whole thing isn't all that dry, and that's Chris Bennett's chapter on a survey of the history of cannabis as a spiritual medicine. And it's not particularly dry because it's a survey. He moves quickly. He doesn't go into great detail like he does in some of his other books. That it takes 2 people to carry some of his books. No offense. He just he's a. I was going to say. Go ahead, Marc.
No, you go ahead, Stephen.
I was just going to say, in case Chris sees this, I didn't mean that as a criticism. Chris is a remarkably thorough researcher, and he just comes up with all this amazing information from the past, and hence there's a lot to put into the books that he writes. Yeah.
And when I talk about the easy read, is there's some books out there that you read a page or two and you got to digest it and read them a few times. And, you know what I mean? So anyways, let's move on from that, because what I think is interesting is, now we're in Canada where cannabis is now legal, and we're seeing this whole shift from the medical side of things to the recreational side of things. And what I love is the shift to the spiritual side of cannabis. And we talked about this with our conversation with Josh and Kelly today. And that was about when, and like you say, Terence McKenna, sit down, shut up and pay attention, right?
That's it.
And where so many people, especially in the past, I'm going to say 30, 40 years, where it's become recreational, it's got all that stigma, dope and stoners and things, but people that, when you're engaged in other activities and using cannabis, say recreationally, you miss out on the potential of what it has spiritually, because it is when you sit down, shut up, and pay attention that you recognize the power that this plant has to take you really deep within and outside of yourself at the same time.
Yeah. Is that a question?
Well, it was kind of a question. It wasn't really a question, but more of a statement.
Okay, I can say something about that.
Yeah, but it's because of that. It's the difference of how we use it, which is like anything, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, we can go into some detail if you're interested, if you want to, about the kind of the mechanics of all that, like things like frequency of use, dosage, strains, all that stuff. But just more or less adding on to what you were just saying, Marc, I would say that it's, you referenced Josh and Kelly, which they had a very interesting thing to say. They kind of they didn't separate. They made it. They make. I think their worldview is that everything is spiritual. In a sense, everything is sacred. So they don't particularly delineate between the ways that they do specifically, particularly use it in spiritual practice ways. Like they'll do it with yoga, they'll do it with meditation. Josh was talking about sitting in his garden, and just sitting in silence. And by the way, the longer you stay there, the better, in that sense. Like I early in the COVID time, way back in April, my wife, who's not really a cannabis person, agreed to, go on some cannabis walks with me around the neighborhood in the early evening when it was light and everything like that. And I would want to, she just takes a very little bit, and I would get more high, and she would want to keep moving, and I'd want to just stand there and stare at a tree or something, or a bush or something, because the longer you stay still and quiet yourself, the more things come alive, in a sense, right? Yeah.
Mhm.
I should tell you a little story about that. That's a fun one. You ever heard of Antonio Villaldo, or Villaldo? It's spelled
I
Villaldo, I think. Yeah.
can't never necessarily
Oh,
say I
he's
have.
written. He's he's billed himself as a kind of a, I don't know, guru, teacher, sort of a guy, with the medicines, psychedelic medicines, and all that. And in one of his books, he told this lovely story about how he was visiting these people in the middle of the jungle somewhere, Peru, perhaps. I don't recall what country he was in. Maybe it was Colombia. Anyway, he was the only person that was out. Was not a villager there. So just him. And he was there for quite a while, and he was, I don't know, getting to know the people and so on. And he started to notice that whenever they walked into the jungle, everything just went on as normal, very loud, lots of birds and animals all, but when he left the village and went for a walk in the jungle, everything went silent. And he tried to figure out why. And it took him a long time. He tried everything. He tried like putting snake grease all over his body, to hide his smell, thinking maybe he had a white man smell, and he tried these different things. And then finally figured out that what the difference was, he had a busy mind. So he's creating electrical impulses, creating, the sort of like caffeinated buzz that we moderns tend to walk around with. And we're moving too fast to be able to connect to the world around us in that way. That's our problem. And so when he finally figured that out, he started to learn how to go slow, walk carefully, not think for the most part, and quiet his mind. And when he did that, then the jungle went, oh, okay, yeah, just another creature. And things kept going as normal. They didn't go silent anymore, right? So that's I think a key spiritual teaching, is that in general, humans are moving too fast. My old Buddhist teacher said, you got to slow down the speed of mind. It doesn't mean like you can't think quickly when you need to or something. It just means that there's too much kind of buzz, caffeinated kind of energy going on. And the world is moving at a different pace than that. You slow down, look at the hummingbird at your back, at your feet or in the back, and just sit really quietly with. And maybe eventually in fact, hummingbirds will do that. You can buy these tiny little hummingbird feeders, and you can put them on top of your feeder for a while so they get used to seeing them there. And then you can put them on your hand and take away the feeder. And I've seen videos, they'll come right up and sit on your hand and drink out of this thing on your hand, but you got to be really calm, really quiet, really unaggressive, right? Yeah. Still, inner stillness. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the challenge. And it's not easy for any of us, really. Certainly not for me. I'm always working at it. My mind always wants to sort of, like put the pedal to the metal and go.
Well, that's my day today. It's just not stopping. But I
Yeah.
really love what you shared about that, because it is that slowing down of the mind, not just the mind, but you related to in the body and our movements. And it reminds me of a story that I heard, and I believe it's true. From some gurus and things that were talking about the ancient origin of the language. And when, you know, spiritual teachers talk, they often talk much slower, more concise. They're not just firing stuff off at 500 words a minute. And they called that Vok. And it was slowing down of the language and the patterns so that you can actually resonate and think more about what you're saying, you know, say more with less words. And it's that softness to the talk, you know. And it's the same thing when we slow ourselves down. When you talk about mentally, physically, and everything else, it's a powerful statement for just any spiritual practice. And you know as well as I do, you know, you talk to people here in the Western world, you know, so many people, it's like, well, do you meditate? I can't meditate. My mind is going too crazy, you know, which
well,
is
that's why you're supposed to meditate.
exactly.
I saw I don't know if it's a Zen saying or some sort of reminder that came from apparently a Zen teacher recently that I thought was pretty good. Kind of funny too, actually. It said, everybody should sit meditation for 20 minutes a day. If you're too busy to sit for 20 minutes, sit for an hour.
Yeah.
In other words, you need it that much more, right? Yeah. You know, I sympathize with people who say that it is challenging, and you know, so in the book, by the way, in the Cannabis and Spirituality book, I talk about how, in a sense, the universal practice, the core practice that is us, you know, like practice are us kind of idea. It's when it is fully embedded in your life, it's not even a practice anymore. It's just a way to move through the world, which is thinking as little as you know, no more than you need to. Like Eckhart Tolle talks about how treat your mind, your thinking mind, as a tool. You can pick it up when you need to use it, but you're fully capable of putting it down when you don't. It doesn't need to create a big ink cloud of obscurity and caffeination, you know?
Yeah.
So, you know, the more we can just settle down, okay, so no, pardon me, I got a little off track. What I was going to say was that in the book, I talk about how the pure practice is just, you know, doing nothing. You just, you know, emptiness meditation. You just sit there, pay attention, you know, or you might do walking meditation, similar. But the pure practice is sitting, because even if you're walking, you have to pay attention to where you're going, you know, and that sort of thing. And there's a lot more going on. So you're activating more parts of your mind. The more you can let all that just sort of settle down, like a pool of water settling down, you know, where the wind is dropped or something like that. It just becomes like a mirror, you know, then that's where you can enter more deeply. And again, with cannabis being an amplifier, that's what it's potentially doing, is deepening that entry, right? But a lot of people, we all have trouble quieting our minds to some degree, and some much more than others, obviously. And so some people who maybe say they can't possibly meditate by sitting down, shutting up and paying attention, could start with sort of like more active meditations and work toward that. For example, there's a Zen meditation practice where you count your breaths. You know, you add, in other words, you add a little bit more form, like something to focus on. And then also like mantra meditations can be like that. Like TM has these simple little mantras that are a way of focusing your attention so that you're not just wandering, right? So all those kinds of things where there's some form involved, where there's some activity to do, can be really helpful. But ultimately, they're like training wheels on your bicycle, is one metaphor that could be appropriate. And eventually, you want to take off those training wheels, so to speak, or drop those crutches. You know, that I don't mean to say that in a disparaging way, but they're helpers that get you closer to where you can just empty yourself. In Chris Killam's book, he talks about how it's called the lotus and the bud, and so like the harmonious marriage between cannabis and yoga, and it's ancient, by the way, as well.
Well, that which is the segue into my next question, if I can just pre-frame it now while you're going into that, is the history of cannabis and spirituality. Like, this isn't just a new thing that we're finding new ways to work with cannabis, right? Because you're talking about cannabis, yoga, and history.
Yeah. No, actually, no, that's not true. I actually copyrighted it 10 years ago No. But let me just answer or finish what I was going to say first.
Yeah.
It's brief. Chris talks a lot about some of the great yoga masters and some of the, amazing experiences of Kundalini, opening they've had and all that. But he quoted this one guy who said, basically now I mostly just sit. This is a yoga guy, right? Mostly just sit in meditation. That's a yoga practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Silent sitting is also a yoga practice, because ultimately, and I'm not sure everyone doing yoga these days understands this as a principle. Ultimately, yoga is, as one Indian guy, what was the name? Hari Puri, I think. Yeah, something like that. Hari Puri Baba. He said, yoga is stopping the chatter of the mind. So what yoga is really for is to wake up. That's what it's really for, right? Yeah. And yes, and that perhaps is a segue into answering the other, the question that you asked, because the sadhus say they are the originators of Hinduism. And the Hindus sometimes say, as some authors have said, is that Hinduism is kind of like the original religion, as well. And the sadhus then claim that they're the original Hindus in that sense. And so the sadhus have been using cannabis for, they were an oral subculture, so they certainly never wrote anything down. But I think they would claim that they've been doing that for a couple thousand years or more. Basically, what the simplest answer to that question is about the history. I mean, I could say a little bit about where it popped up here and there, but the really simple answer about that is the lineage that cannabis comes from is estimated to be between 30 and 90 million years old on this planet. And so the plant is old. It's really, really old. It's older than, sapiens, Homo sapiens, for sure, and probably long before sapiens, but certainly by the time sapiens had come into the picture 40 or 50 or 60,000 years ago, I don't recall for sure. You would know every plant in your neighborhood, right? You didn't have Safeway to go to, so you needed to know what was in your environment, and you would find out, over time, passed down from generation to generation, what plants could be edible, what plants could be for medicine, what plants could be used for building materials, and what plants were poisonous and you didn't want to go anywhere near them, right? And, that would be self-selecting pretty quickly if you ate a deadly poisonous plant, right? Like, nope, nobody else is going to touch that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're just not going anywhere near that particular
You
one.
try it. No, you try it. No, really. You try it.
Yeah, like the king who gets people to test all his food for him because he thinks he's going to be poisoned. Yeah. So, cannabis has been around, and where it was out throughout Asia and other parts of the world, but it's believed that it came from, Far East. People would have found it, and they would have found, all you had to do, was like try it, eat it sometime, and even though it's oil activated, maybe somebody had the idea, like, well, what if we just like, fry it, put it with some yak butter, and then you eat it, and you go, okay, now we know what this plant can do with your mind, right? Or if they accidentally, like this, I don't know if I've got that pronunciation right, the Scythians or Scythians, they were around, I don't know for how long, but a Greek writer, Herodotus, wrote about them in, I don't know, 1500 before Common Era, something like that. And I think they were kind of nomads. They traveled around a lot throughout Asia, and they had reports of they were cannabis people. They would grow their own. I guess they couldn't have been that nomadic, but in any case, they would have funerary services where they'd have something small, like a kind of like a sweat lodge, and they'd take massive amounts of cannabis, like the plant with all the shake or leaves, and they'd throw it on the fire. And then Herodotus said, and then they would shout for joy. So 20,000 years ago, all you needed to do was, pull up a plant, throw it on a fire, and get a little too close, and you knew what this plant could do as a mind-altering substance, right? So basically, the even simpler summary to that line of thinking is that cannabis and humans are extremely entwined, and always have been, as far as I can tell.
Well, and Stephen, that's what the goal of this program is to wake people up to that
Uh-huh.
it's not just some illegal drug for, for reasons that don't make sense. This plant is a medicinal healer and teacher,
Mm-hmm.
like
Yeah.
so many plants are out there. And
Yeah.
it's the misperception that has been put on our current culture over the past 50 plus years,
Yeah.
if not more now.
Right.
Go ahead.
More now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that has really created this cultural stigma against it.
Yeah.
And that's why I want people to wake up to the powers that this plant has on so
Mm.
many different levels without even altering your mind,
That's
right?
right. Yeah. Well, fortunately, the stigma is disappearing pretty rapidly. It's, sort
Mm,
of dissolving into the air where it belongs to go. And basically, the 20th century has been a hellish century for plant medicine and for indigenous people, and, anything other than a sort of a dominator worldview, really suffered throughout the 20th century. Not that it just started then, but cannabis in particular started to run afoul of the dominators, particularly in the 20th century. I mean, in 19th century America, I think up until the early 20th century, I don't remember the dates, but in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you could go into a pharmacy and they would have any pharmacy anywhere in the United States. I don't know if every single one did, but in general, cannabis was legal, and they would have tinctures, and they would say, oh yeah, for mom's headache, or mother's little helper, or whatever, and you could just get cannabis products legally throughout the United States. The country that now has it in what they call Schedule 1, which means has extreme danger and no usefulness at all, right?
mhm.
So it's just been a short period it's an anomalous little chunk of time, and it's dying, thank God.
Well,
Yeah.
and I thank you for the work you're doing for being part of that, because I think it's important that people like you, because you were doing this stuff before it was even fully legal here in Canada in that sense. But you talked about the indigenous people and their culture and their ways throughout
Mhm.
history and the different plant medicines that they would use for healing, transformation, spirituality. And I know that you also have a you know you've spent time with the Native American church as well. So maybe
Mhm.
you could share a little bit about that and the importance of, kind of maintaining and reclaiming parts of this culture.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good one. I went to I connected with a guy named Ken Littlefish, also known as Canucas, Native American guy living near Port Angeles on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. Somebody had given me his phone number, somebody who thought I might be interested in going to one of those meetings sometime. And so I called Ken up and asked if I could come to one of his meetings. They call them meetings oftentimes, and he said sure, and I did. And right from the get-go, I was blown away with the. I've been around quite a number of containers, both with medicines and not. Like I've been around the sort of encounter group movement back in the 70s. I was involved with Tibetan Buddhist practice for quite a while, and lots of different kinds of practices and ceremonies and containers, and I've been in ayahuasca ceremonies in Peru and the same kinds of ceremonies up here, and I've also been involved with the Santo Daime Church up here. I've probably been to a couple of dozen of their ceremonies over the last 5 years. They are an ayahuasca using church, originally from Brazil. And of all those kinds of ceremonies and containers, I guess is the key word there, the Native American church is the most perfect, almost you could say, and like like a solid container. Everything that they do in that teepee, I mean, it's very disciplined. It's not completely without humor, but it's very disciplined, And Ken Littlefish that I mentioned a while ago, he once said, relatives, he calls it everybody, they call it everybody relatives, right? Says relatives, there aren't many rules in this teepee, and they're all for one purpose, and that is not to interfere with the movement of spirit into this teepee. You know, he said, when people can, do this, Terrence, he didn't use that language, sit down, shut up and pay attention scenario, and you're deep in that medicine space. And this is again where the Antonio Villaldo anecdote is relevant, because, nature is listening, spirits are listening, but only if you can quiet your mind and space enough and open up enough of a gap for that to come in. And Ken said, when everybody can do that in the teepee, and it pretty much requires everybody, like every person is important, and if you're sitting there with a buzzy mind or talking to the person beside you in the circle, the teepee with a fire in the middle, then what Ken said is that the spirit will come in. And he said, sometimes everyone sees it. It's not like, like a fairy that you see floating in on wings, but like a light or something, there'll be like a little beam of light and everybody will see it. But if it comes, he said, it's like a deer, it's like a shy deer. It'll come in. But if it feels that aggression of that speed of mind, poof, gone. And he said, when that happens, it won't come back that night, So everything they do in that teepee is to encourage people to open themselves to that space and keep themselves, inner stillness and more or less, physical stillness as well. They don't move. You're in there. It varies, but you might be in there from 9 or 9:30 at night, and typically you don't get out of that teepee until around 10 or sometimes later in the following morning, right? So you're in there for 12, 13, sometimes 14 hours, and in all that time, you might only get up to go to the bath. They actually let half the teepee out to go to the bathroom around about midnight or 1, and you're not out long. They're doing it while they're singing these songs, and when the instruments are on one side of the teepee going around person to person, they'll have the other side go out for one person's song or songs. They sing 4 songs, but they're short songs. They're like, I don't know, a minute and a half each or something. So you got 5 minutes to go take a pee at 1 in the morning or whatever. And that may be it, you may not get up again until 10 in the morning, and so, you're just there to pay attention. You're there to pray for what they've asked you to pray for. That's another thing about them too, is that, okay, 2 aspects of that. One is that most meetings happen because someone has asked for it. And that person becomes the sponsor for that meeting. And they can ask for something really serious, like a sick or dying relative, a friend who's in prison, and many of their people were in prison. Or it could be as lighthearted as a birthday or an anniversary or a baptism of a child, They do baptized children in there. And so the person who's the sponsor sets the prayer. And then everybody is asked, at least until about 3 in the morning or so, to put their mind on that prayer as much as possible while all these songs, chant like songs, are going around the teepee. And so that can be really powerful. The same guy, Ken, said one time in the morning, this is when they talk, is in the morning, Ken said one time, he said, relatives, I don't mean this judgmentally. It's just true. Back in the old days, he started in the 60s. They were repressed a lot, or oppressed, and they had to go deep underground, way out they'd have like 2-hour walk into the middle of a forest somewhere so that the authorities wouldn't know what they were doing. They didn't even allow young people in those days because young people can have loose lips, right? And so almost everybody was an elder. In fact, the only reason Ken was there because it was the classic shaman thing where they'd visioned him ahead of time and then called him in. So he was the young person, but everybody else was like, maybe 50s, 60s, even 70s in there. And he said, compared to then, we're pitiful. He says, in our ability to be empty and pay attention. He said, in those days, those people could sit there and be in silence and still not fidgety all night. And he said, I'm not exaggerating. When people could do that, things would happen that you would consider conventionally miracles. He said, I'm not kidding, folks. I have seen a person come in there with crutches and a broken leg and walk out with 2 legs and no crutches in the morning. I've seen people come into that teepee with cancer that they said was terminal, and go back to the doctor, 3 days later, and the doctor says, what happened to your cancer? What's going on here? What did you do? That kind of thing. So, which is a wonderful teaching in my mind, because it shows the potential. And again, this is, we talked about this, or I brought it up with Josh and Kelly this morning. This is what Bruce Damer is on about these days. Another one of our presenters at this year's conference, is that we're at the sort of dawning stages of the recognition that we are potentially a meta-organism as a collective, that the more people put their minds in the same place, the more we can actually, that intention can influence the material realm, right?
Mm.
So it's a great teaching that way. And then just as far as, because you asked, I'll just say that I have a deep, deep love and respect for the Native American Church, because it has saved so many lives. The use of peyote ritually goes back, they say, thousands of years, but the Native American Church itself wasn't constituted until around about 1880 or 90, somewhere in there. And ironically, you might say, just in the way that it was ironic that LSD escaped in the culture because the CIA were experimenting on the wrong people, namely Ken Kesey and some of his friends, and they went, oh yeah, you think you're doing these bad experiments, but this is an awakening substance, and I'm going to tell people about it.
Yeah.
Well, what happened with the Native American Church was that there were small groups using it in different parts of the United States. But in the, I don't know when it was exactly, 1850s, 60s, maybe, the cruel, heartless American government was moving Indians or Native Americans off their land and sending them all to these reserves in Oklahoma. And so disparate tribes that had never had any contact with each other before were all in these sort of, like almost like refugee camp sort of things, right? And then they found out what other people are doing, and they found out about the peyote ceremonies. And now there are 400,000 members of the Native American Church, mostly across the western half of the United States. And it's legal in a country that's so backward about drugs, cannabis and Schedule I, for God's sakes, cannabis, I mean, you want to put anything in Schedule I, put alcohol in it. But
Yeah, no kidding, right?
Cannabis, please.
But
it's legal. It's legal in the United States. And the reason is because the Congress of the United States actually acknowledged that people come into those meetings who are drug addicted, perhaps suicidal, alcoholics. The peyote in that context shows them what they're doing, shows them that they're on a death trap path, right? And they go, oh my God, I have a choice now. I can either, continue to kill myself, and it might not be that long, or I can get my act together. And they get their act together, and and people can prove that. And the Congress went, yeah, okay, you guys can do that legally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And no, you said so much there that
typical of me.
Yeah, well, that's okay. But I love what you said about how they only had the elders in for a long time, and and how they were able to sit still. And it just got me thinking about how we live in the Western world today, where everything's just so busy. For people to sit down and still down for those miracles to happen for themselves, just in a simple meditation. Which is the one thing that came to mind. But I know I had the honor to sit in a Native American church meeting with Don Blakey. And
yes,
it was the last one before he passed. His family, his kids were there as officers and things, and it was the most beautiful thing. I had no idea what was going on because I didn't know what to expect, sitting up that long in a long house, but the fire, the ritual, the ceremony around everything we did was one of those moments of my life that I was just like, wow. These are the things that we get that are lost in these concrete jungles of cities that we live in, with all this mind scatter and chatter and everything that's going on, to see how this has been maintained and brought as an ancient ritual.
Absolutely,
and which is one thing I wanted to bring up that's really important, is working with any medicine. Well, one I was going to say about when you're talking about Congress and legalization and things of that nature was the we've had this conversation before. Who gives anyone the right to make nature illegal? These are
Oh, yeah.
plants that grow naturally. There's just, we got to wake up, folks, right?
Yeah.
Wake up to the fact that you can't make something that's natural and part of God's green earth, that this planet that we live in, that we've been destroying so badly, to make that kind of stuff illegal, right?
Absolutely. And it's another aspect of that. I mean, I completely agree with you there. And I mean, only, sorry, an idiot would not agree with that, basically, in my view, or a
Well,
person with their head in the sand. But the other aspect of that, that's the same in a sense, but is a different slant on looking at that. And it's really central, because it's something that's changing now, and it absolutely has to change, is that in the past, in these cultures, these sort of big dominator type cultures, there has been, by the controlling elites, the church, the government, whoever is the influencers, the controllers in the culture, have always had a patronizing attitude toward the public, and so that's the other aspect. You say you don't have the right, nobody has the right to outlaw a plant. Well, nobody also has the right to tell me what plant or what anything else I can do to myself, as long as I'm not harming anybody else. Yeah, I'm totally fine with them saying I can't shoot you. They can put me away for the rest of my life if I shoot you, willy-nilly. But nobody has the right to tell me I can't use cannabis, psilocybin, LSD, or for that matter, even a narcotic. It's a shame when people get addicted to narcotics, of course, but still, it's, what's changing on this planet, what has to change, and what's changing on this planet is that human beings have to be allowed to grow up and be responsible for themselves, and no patronizing patriarchal authority person, particularly men, by the way, that's where that word comes from, like pater, padre, father, right? Patronizing culture, or elites, I mean, have the right to tell me how to live my life, as long as I'm not creating social chaos, right? Social harm. Yeah.
Yeah,
None of their bloody business. They can't. They even try to tell us not to kill ourselves, right? It's illegal to to commit suicide in many places. And what's the punishment? Like a death penalty? What are they going to do?
Well, it's for those who, I guess, don't succeed.
Yeah, right. But no, I'm being joking about that. But there's real social harm from a law like that, because I think it means that your inheritors are disinherited or something like that. Insurance claims are invalid, all that kind of stuff. So no, in other words, just nobody has the right to tell us what plants or substance we can take. Period. Or make any of them outlawed.
And I completely agree. And it's just, I've had, Laurie Schneider as well, a friend of ours, and, it's just amazing just learning about all the natural plants in our neighborhoods, and, even the history of how all of a sudden dandelion become a weed, like there's all these, colonial type, big business, whatever it is, that kind of has their grips and influence on that. But let's back up to a point, because without going down that rabbit hole, which is a whole nother conversation.
Oh, yeah.
I want to talk about, before we wrap up, is the importance of any of these medicines that we use, about the responsibility side, the set and setting, and the importance to, treat these plants with respect, and use it in a safe way, of course.
Yeah.
Right. So your thoughts on, the importance of, the container. You lead ceremonies, semi-regular, used to anyways, before all the world changed. But it's always setting a specific, it's not just people sitting around getting high.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, yeah, sure. I could say a few things about that, I suppose. One is that something you said earlier in our conversation, which is, if you don't, to put it somewhat crudely again, sit down, shut up, and pay attention, you're potentially, and maybe quite likely, missing what the plant can really do if you, in fact, do that. Like the difference between taking, say, mushrooms at a party mixing it with cannabis, maybe with beer, and a lot of noise around you, and going out into the woods and sitting down in silence, or, just lying down. That's what Terrence said, like the sit down, shut up, and pay attention thing. He would lie down, put eye shades over himself, and go,
Mm.
and he always wanted to do it alone. He said, I'm probably giving bad medical advice, so that's another issue. But he says, that's the way I prefer to do it, because I don't want any distractions. I don't want anything going on around me at all, right? He just wanted to go where the medicine took him. This is the surrender. This is when you talk about respect. This is what they all say. And another one of our presenters, by the way, is Martina Hoffman and her partner Pascal Ferry. They're both incredibly good psychedelic painters. I mean, if you saw their paintings, anyone watching this, which you will at the conference, I think they'll have some slides. They're amazing, especially her. I don't know his work much, but they're both incredible. And people probably even seen some of her images. But I remember her speaking at a conference one time and saying, that the one thing you have to remember when you take ayahuasca, that you always have to put as number one priority, is surrender. You will not learn what this medicine has to teach you unless you surrender. Well, obviously, when you're talking about respect for the medicine, well, there's a whole bunch of other things that could be said about respect, like respect for the medicine, respect for the cultures they came from, et cetera, et cetera. But respecting the container, because you have to feel, if you're going to surrender, at the very least, you have to feel safe. If you feel there's any threat in the physical environment, you're not likely to be able to surrender, right? But then beyond that, in terms of respect too, it's like, yeah, because that's the key, is respecting the power of these plants, recognizing that they can actually open up spiritual channels in an amazing way, and or they can open up the places that you've been hiding from or held back by, and show those to you. And that happens over and over and over again. So there's respect for that. And some people would say respect for the fact there's actually spirits involved here, not all good spirits necessarily, which is another argument for proper setting and good guidance. And then beyond that, there's respect for the sort of environment altogether, and where these substances or medicines and things come from. Peyote, for example, is an endangered plant right now, or a fungus. Ayahuasca is being misused by a lot of people. There's a lot of cultural appropriation and ayahuasca tourism that isn't always healthy going on. And so it's just really comes down to multi-level respect.
Yeah, so true. And and that's the other thing, is just making sure you're working with the right people. And that's about references from others, and just being mindful. And one of the other rules I know that you have in many cases is dosage is something you want to do low and slow.
Start small until you know your medicine. That's for damn sure. Even with cannabis, because we know how powerful that substance can be, these days, especially with the concentrates, the hash oils and the shatter and all these things. Some of these things
extracts are like 95% THC.
Yeah, people like Chris Killam, who's a master of this plant and yoga, and I mentioned his book earlier, Lotus in the Bud. He doesn't, he's not down really with these highly concentrated ones. And neither is Paulo Roberto from the Santo Daime Church, who, has worked with this stuff a lot. Like you don't need to, as Chris Killam said, blast yourself. Right?
No, there's something about the natural properties of a plant, right? As soon as you start extracting it and doing different things, and sure, you're getting some good stuff out of it. And it's kind of like when you were talking earlier about opioids and narcotics, right? Things like heroin and cocaine, all are derived from plants. Right? But it's when we put them in these unnatural concentrations without all the other properties of the plant, you strip the spirit out of the plant, all of those things, all of a sudden you have a very different, what my friend Sherry Strong would call, anytime you take something green and turn it white, it's a drug. Right? But if it's green, it's a whole different story.
Yeah, no, that's great. And and it just occurred to me when you were saying that the sort of almost like the archetypal example of that is the coca plant. And tragically, I would say the coca plant itself has been vilified because of its relationship to cocaine. But
Yeah.
coca, as wonderful anthropologists like Wade Davis have made very clear, is a beneficial plant. It's a health-giving plant, and people in the Andes in South America use it for, days, for example, when they want to do really strenuous work or go on a very, very long hike. There's this special, I think, I forget where it is, Ecuador, maybe, that Wade has been involved with Bolivia or Ecuador. So like a pilgrimage way, way up in the high mountains, and they go for days. And Wade said, I thought I was in pretty good shape, but these people blew me away, but they were all chewing coca, you know.
Yeah.
And it's not addictive as far as anyone, I've never heard anyone say coca, the plant, is addictive. But, cocaine is so highly concentrated, of course, that it's a whole different ball game.
Well, the same as sugar, right? Let's take a look at something that we would take so for granted and commonplace, sugar. Comes
Uh-huh.
from sugar cane, it's green, make
Yep.
it white, and that stuff lights up your opioid receptors in your brains more than cocaine and heroin is what they're saying. So
Really?
it's just, yeah. So for me, it's that's why I love things in its natural form as much as
Uh-huh.
possible, right? Because
Yes.
there's something that's natural about it. It's like processed foods,
Yeah.
versus something raw and organic.
Yeah. Well, that's probably a good rule of thumb for anybody to apply to the foods they eat, that we don't need to be rigid about it. I like potato chips, good ones anyway, but as a general rule of thumb, you're probably going to be better off the closer you stay to the original food or the original source. By the time it goes from like apple to apple juice to an apple cinnamon granola bar to some kind of candy or whatever, it's gone through a lot of hands. It gets a lot of chemicals added to it, and so on and so on and so on. So yeah, just as a general rule of thumb, the closer you can stay to nature. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was doing some studying years ago just in health principles, and it was brought to my
Okay.
attention. We're talking about natural food, and thinking of ourselves as a human and animal, and what would we do naturally, you know.
Mhm.
And they brought up orange juice as an example, and it was when you mentioned apple juice. It's like, if we were just a human animal, foraging around, we wouldn't all of a sudden be going and juicing 10 oranges for one glass of juice,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You would never, if you were to eat that orange and it's, the way it's meant to be eaten that way
Yeah.
naturally, you'd never take in that much sugar, and you're getting all the pulp and everything else, and it's going to
Mhm.
fill you up instead of drinking 3 glasses of orange juice. That's something that wouldn't be a
Yeah.
natural.
And if you were doing this 200 years ago, you probably took the peel and, made jam out of it or something, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
or dye for your clothing or something.
Yeah, for
Mm.
sure. Well, they used it all.
Yeah, well, we might be heading that way again.
Well,
Definitely gotta move, in that general direction. I don't know if we'll ever get back to that kind of simplicity as a culture or as a species, but I think we have a better chance of survival if we start making it simpler and making use of things, everything like that. We've
well, taking care of our planet and
yeah.
eating better, and
Mhm.
watching these chemicals that are pumped out everywhere and things. And that's why I just love the idea of waking up to our natural potential, and cannabis as a spiritual ally is certainly a, I'm not going to say gentle, but I'm not going to say it's not gentle, but it's a great tool to open up that, even a connection with nature.
Mhm. Well, when you say gentle, by the way, yeah, it can be a powerful psychedelic, absolutely. But
Mm.
if you keep it down to a certain level of dosage, it can be both powerful and gentle at the same time, in a way that you would not find with most of the other psychedelics. When you get up into activated kind of dosages, beyond threshold kind of doses and all that, they're pretty intense for a while.
Mm.
Whereas cannabis can take you really deep and still feel gentle. In fact, that's kind of what it does in a way. Again, you can have so much that, even if you can ride with it, you're still, consorting with the leprechauns for a while there,
Mhm.
or, flipped upside down and carried by your toes through, strange alien landscapes. That can happen too. But if you're sort of, in the mid-range somewhere, you can have what could feel like a really powerful experience, and it can be gentle in the sense that to experience that depth, you have to relax into it. So you can actually relax into it, and you go, sometimes I just feel like this isn't really a drug; it's a reality
Mhm.
enhancer. It's
Yeah.
not like it takes you somewhere else if you're using it that way. If you're paying attention, if you're staying present with it and quieting the mind, like we've been talking about, it just deepens your connection to the moment that you're in, and in that sense, it's just a reality amplifier.
Beautiful. Well,
Yeah.
Stephen, we're pretty much at the end of our hour, so maybe you can tell folks if they want to know more where they can find your book, your website.
Sure. Well, the book should be available in bookstores and easily through Amazon and sites like that as well. Excuse me. It's called Cannabis and Spirituality: An Explorer's Guide to an Ancient Plant Spirit Ally. And then I have a website, StephenGrayVision.com, StephenGray Vision.com. And I'm pretty active on Facebook, both through our project, Spirit Plant Medicine, and on my Stephen Gray Vision, same name, Facebook. And I also have a YouTube channel where I've been interviewing leading figures in psychedelics work in particular. And that's also called Stephen Gray Vision, but the Stephen Gray are put together as all one word, Stephen Gray and then Vision. And those can be accessed as audio files on anchor.fm as well, ANCHOR.fm. So thank you for asking that question,
Yeah.
Marc. And
Well,
of
and
course, the
thank
main thing is, like, as a hockey player would say, if he just happened to win the most valuable player award that year, and they're still in the playoffs, he's going to say, I don't care about that. I just want to win. So what we want right now is we want people to be part of the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, because we passionately, I think you would agree with me that you feel similarly, feel that, not to be immodest about it, we don't know how big of an influence this conference is, but it's part of what is essential on this planet, is getting the message that there's a potential to wake up and re-recognize our sane and proper relationship to ourselves, to each other, and to the planet, and to the cosmos altogether.
Well, and it's getting the right information so you can make better decisions in terms of the healing work you want to do. And Stephen, you've done a great job over the years bringing some of the the best speakers and presenters and researchers and doctors and facilitators to the conference. So we're looking forward to that. And just as a shout out to that, it's spiritplantmedicine.com. It's October 23rd to 25th. I think you've got 33 presenters lined up and musicians.
Some of them are performers.
Yeah.
Not technically, well, I guess you could call them all presenters if you want, but we have a performance, sort of a spirit-infused performance poet.
And we even have an online cannabis ceremony on the Saturday night.
Indeed, we do.
So if
Yes.
anybody is watching this and you're interested in spirit plant medicine work, you've got Stephen's information there in the comments, and spiritplantmedicine.com, again, October 23rd to 25th. And we even have a discount code for you. It's VSPMC 2020. And you can join there's a free membership site. There's tons of information. Go to YouTube, Google. If this is anything that's waking you up to look at different allies and plant teachers and things to facilitate and be part of your growth and awakening, please visit spiritplantmedicine.com. There's lots of information there, and do your own research. And I thank you again, Stephen, for joining us on your wake-up call. I thank you, Somya, for running the back end as you do so gracefully every week. I appreciate that. Thank you, PMC Global, PSSM, and Conscious Living Network. I thank you all. And again, my guest was Stephen Gray, and our conversation was cannabis and spirituality. Until next time, everyone, thank you so much.
Cheers.